Let's finally get started with the first functionality of our hook. To start, we'll focus on being able to display and looping through an array of titles passed to the hook. First, open up the usePleaseStay file and ensure that that's the one in the root src directory and not the one in the example folder. Now, let's allow our hook to accept parameter titles, which will be type array string. Next, we want the document title to animate when the tab has lost focus. Luckily, JavaScript provides a visibility change event that we can add a listener to. As soon as our hook mounts, we'll begin listening for this event. We can do this with React's useEffect hook, being sure to provide the empty dependency array so it fires on mount only. And we'll call the actual event listener function handle visibility change. And as I mentioned, since we only want this to run on mount, we'll pass an empty dependency list to the useEffect hook. Now, the first TypeScript error we have is that TypeScript cannot find the types for document since we haven't included DOM in our libcompiler options. So let's go to the tsconfig.json in our root and add the DOM library to the list of libraries. It's also best practice to remove listener functions whenever a React hook unmounts. This is possible within our useEffect hook by returning a function from useEffect. Whatever is in this returned function is fired as part of the unmounting process. We can use this function to remove our event listener. So that's return. I'll use an arrow function and document.remove event listener, visibility change, and the same function, handle visibility change. Now we need to actually write our handle visibility change function. When the value of document.visibilityState is not visible, we should be iterating through the titles provided to our hook. Otherwise, we should stop iterating through those titles. We can track whether or not we should be iterating through these titles using a React state variable. Let's create a state variable and setter pair using React's useState hook. I will call them should iterate titles and set should iterate titles. And initially, this will be set to false. We can import that. And so our handle visibility change function becomes set should iterate titles based on the value of document.visibility state and when it does not equal visible. So we now have a stateful variable that changes when the visibility of the page changes. That's great, but we need to add functionality to actually modify the document title. For this, we'll leverage JavaScript's setInterval function. However, we can't use setInterval right away. It's not the best idea to use setInterval directly with React hooks. Like our document change function, we also need to account for cleanup and any intervals we set up to prevent memory leaks. This is a bit tricky to do in React, but it's definitely doable. Let's begin by writing a new custom React hook useInterval. So we'll make a new file right alongside usePleaseStay called useInterval. So this will be export const useInterval. And for the parameters passed to this hook, we'll at least need a callback or whatever we want to run at the given interval. And the interval itself, which will be a number. The first thing we'll do is store a reference to the callback that's passed in, and we'll do this with the React hook useRef. We then need to make sure that every time callback changes, we're updating the current value of the callback ref. So once again, we require the use of useEffect. And whenever this callback changes, we're going to update the current value of the callback ref. Finally, we can get to using JavaScript's built-in setInterval function. So we'll create another useEffect, and this one will fire whenever the interval changes. So what we'll do is store the interval ID from setInterval, and we'll call the current callback ref. And of course, at the interval provided. And as mentioned, the whole reason we're creating this custom hook is so we can have proper cleanup of this set interval. So just as we did in usePleaseStay, we'll use the return function in useEffect here to clean up this ID. And that can be done by calling JavaScript's built-in clearInterval function with the interval's ID. We should also have a way to start and stop this setInterval call from running. Let's add a parameter shouldRun type Boolean to our hook. We can add shouldRun to the dependency array in our second useEffect hook. And when shouldRun switches to false, we can simply return from this effect. And we now have a React lifecycle safe way of using setInterval. Let's jump back into usePleaseStay and start using useInterval. And as we said, the trigger for iterating through our titles is this shouldIterateTitles. And so for now, I will throw it into our useInterval function, just with an empty function. We'll do 500 milliseconds as the interval, and use that shouldIterateTitle state variable as the shouldRun trigger. And within this body will be the actual logic that triggers the document title change. Let's first create another state variable that will keep track of the current index of the titles array. I'll just call that title index. And its initial value will be 0. And within the interval function, we'll first create a const called nextIndex, just for improved readability, which will be title index plus 1. And to safely set our title index, we will use a ternary by checking if the next index is already at the titles.length. We will start back at 0. Otherwise, we're safe to set the title index to that next index. Now finally, we've arrived at the user-facing functionality of our hook, and that is setting the value of document.title. We can use another useEffect here, where the dependencies will be the titles themselves and also the title index. And since we've hooked into the title index, every 500 milliseconds, when this useInterval hook fires and updates the title index, we just need to set document.title to titles at the title index. So I'm going to clean this up, save this, and now let's try out our hook to see if it's working as expected. First, let's be sure that we're in the example project root. So I'm going to cd into the example folder. And before we run our custom script to copy the hook in, we also need to copy in useInterval since it's used by usePleaseStay. So let's extend our script in the example package.json to do that. So I'm going to keep this command, and I'm also just going to copy the use interval hook to the folder here in our example project. And now we can run our copy hook script. And in the call to use please stay in app.tsx, we'll need to add our newly required array of title strings. And we can see, of course, that TypeScript is already complaining. It expects us to pass in our titles array. So we'll just pass in something like title 1, title 2, and title 3. Now we can start up our example app with npm start. And here in the browser, if we have this React app in focus, we should of course see title 1. And as we expect, the titles should not be iterating because this tab is in focus. However, as soon as we open another browser tab, we see, as expected, our titles are iterating as provided. So in summary, we created an onMount useEffect hook to listen to when the visibility change event fires. And we also added in the cleanup step to remove that event listener should this hook be unmounted. And we set up a state variable to be set according to the document.visibility state. We then wrote a custom useInterval hook, which we would use to run our title changing functionality when should iterate titles goes to true. And finally, we hooked into both the titles and the title index in that every time the title index changes, we set the document title according to the title's value at that title index. So we've already got a fully functioning React hook. In the next lesson, we'll learn how to package our hook as an npm module using rollup.